I think many, if not most, readers have that one author who they either really, really like or they at one time really, really liked, but they have to acknowledge that that author is, in some way, a little bit problematic. And for me, that author is Piers Anthony. Piers Anthony was the first adult writer that I ever read, and when I was in late middle school, early high school, I loved his books. I read every single one of his books that I could get my hands on. He was one of my all-time favorite authors. And looking back at his works as a man in his late 20s, I admit that he can be a really, really imaginative writer. When he wants to be. Some of the worlds that he's created and some of the ideas that he's written about in his novels are just brilliant. He has written some of the most fascinating and imaginative stories that I've ever read. He can also write some of the most meandering, dull, preachy, and nonsensical stories ever put on paper. And the problem is that when he's writing these types of stories, he's so caught up in his own brilliance that he doesn't even realize that he's writing pure crap. I already talked a little bit about Piers Anthony's shortcomings when I reviewed the Geodesy series back in 2009, but there are still 3 more of his book series that I have at one time considered to be favorites, and we're going to look at one of them today, the Incarnations of Immortality series. The Incarnations of Immortality series is definitely one of Piers Anthony's more fascinating ideas. He takes us into a futuristic world where magic and technology exist alongside each other, where not only has technology advanced considerably, but we've also rediscovered magic and we use it just as much as we use science. As such, this is also a world where every myth that has ever been written about Christianity is true in a very, very literal sense, and the personifications of various aspects of our existence, like death, time, fate, war, and nature, are actually offices that are held by ordinary mortals like you and me. And in the course of this 7-book series, I realized that he did actually write an 8th book recently, but I haven't read it and have no plans to read it, so as far as we're concerned, it is a 7-book series, and during the course of this series, he told a very compelling story about the nature of good versus evil, told from 7 distinct points of view. Now, I said earlier that we were going to look at the entire series today, but in fact, I was lying a little bit, because I decided that I want to do this series a little bit differently than I've done series in the past. Normally with a series of books, I treat one series, like the Harry Potter series or the series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket, as one book on the favorites list, so I'll just review it as a whole. I do this because usually the books are written similarly enough and they follow the same group of characters and they're part of one overarching storyline that it doesn't really make any sense to review every individual book, so I just review the entire story. However, the Incarnations of Immortality series is a little bit different because, first of all, it's being told, as I said earlier, from 7 distinct points of view. Each book focuses around one of the different incarnations of immortality, and so we are following the story from 7 different characters. And even though all 7 of these books are essentially episodes in the same story, they're looking at it from different perspectives, they are not even really in chronological order, and they can each stand alone as their own story. Plus, I feel differently about all of them, so I'm going to actually do a short separate review for each of the 7 books as I finish reading them, and then I will wrap it up at the end. And so that's a pretty long lead-in to say that this is Favorite Books Review number 52, Part 1, looking at On a Pale Horse by Piers Anthony. This is the first and quite possibly the best book in the series, which I know is not a really good indication of things to come, but bear with me. And this focuses around the incarnation of death. But as I said, death isn't just one person, it is an office that is served by several people, and one of those people is Zane. We meet Zane at the beginning of the story when he has basically lost everything that he's ever had. And Zane has decided that life is not worth living anymore and he is going to commit suicide. But just as he is getting ready to pull the trigger, he sees out of the corner of his eye death approaching to take his soul. And the last minute, he turns the gun on death, shoots death, and kills him. And before any of you get comment crazy, it is not a spoiler if it's the premise of the novel. So Zane has killed death, and whoever kills death has to assume his office. That is how the office is passed along. So now Death has to pick up the scythe and the cloak and the pale horse. Well, he doesn't pick up the pale horse, he gets on the pale horse, but you know what I mean. And go about the business of collecting the souls of people who have died. In addition to collecting their souls, he also has to make the decision of whether the soul goes to heaven, hell, or purgatory, depending on the balance of good and evil in their soul. And the balance is measured in a very, very literal sense. It's like a score sheet. Eventually, death does get caught up in the overall plot of the series, and at this point we're basically in the middle of it. Remember, this series doesn't exactly go in chronological order. But that doesn't happen until a few chapters into the book, as Death is getting acclimatized to his new job. And normally that's the sort of thing that would bother me, but I have to admit it's kind of nice to see a book that's not driven by plot or even really by character, but by an idea. This book actually does really well what I feel fantasy novels should be doing. Take an idea that is a part of our normal, mundane, everyday existence and look at it from an impossible point of view, from a fantastical point of view. This story looks at the idea of death from a point of view that we as mortals would never be able to look at it from the guy who is actually in the business of collecting your souls when you die. And so we see death from many, many different facets as Zane is trying to perform this duty. In particular, the issue of euthanasia is explored pretty thoroughly in this novel at a time when it was even more taboo than it is today. But it also looks at issues like suicide and atheism and what constitutes good and what constitutes evil and how and why we define things in that way. Zane has to grapple with many of the moral implications of being the personification of death, the guy in charge of death and dying, and it's kind of fascinating to see him grapple with the morals of his job, even as we are also grappling with them. And there is a plot, of course, but even the plot of this story deals with the ethics and the morality of death and all of those issues that we talked about earlier. It actually folds in really rather nicely. And what I discovered while rereading this novel is that many of Anthony's trademark flaws in his writing are actually pretty well downplayed in this novel. He can get a little preachy at times, but honestly, he does do a good job of presenting both sides of any given argument. The plot does meander a bit, but with this being an idea-driven novel, that's kind of the idea, and the story never really meanders away from that idea of the many-faceted view of death. And the story does contain a fair bit of explicit naughty bits and borderline sexism, but honestly, even those are downplayed, and the female characters in this story are admittedly pretty kick-ass. Even the characterization is pretty decent as Zane tries to grapple with his own feeling towards death and his own encounters with it in the past. On its own, this book actually achieves a pretty decent balance between idea, plot, and characterization, and that's actually pretty impressive coming from this particular author. As far as Piers Anthony novels go, this one is definitely one of his better ones. If you read any book in the Incarnations of Immortality series, read this one. It's definitely one of the better ones, and on the worth meter, I'd give this a worth owning new. Tune in next time when I'll review the second book in the Incarnations of Immortality series, Bearing an Hourglass. Night and day, people. Night and day.